Hey everybody, we're back with another special episode of the Real-Time Analytics Podcast today. As I hope you all know, we launched our second podcast series called Keyboard and Quill at the start of March, and it's been really great to see how everybody's been reacting. Keyboard and Quill is really more of a tech history podcast. We're trying to bring together various threads of innovation and technology development and cultural change over the last 40,000 years, bringing all those threads together to the technology that we normally talk about in this podcast. And it's got some really great sound design and editing to enhance the listening experience. Anyway, for episodes on the history of telecommunications, I talked to Dr. Mara Mills, a professor in the Media Studies Department at NYU. Yes, that NYU, about the history of the telephone. And it was such a cool conversation. We only used a few snippets of it in Keyboard and Quill. I wanted you to be able to hear the whole thing. I think it is really on point and worth your time. So before we jump into that, I also need to remind you the Real-Time Analytics Summit is coming up May 7th through 9th in San Jose, California. You can go to rtasummit.com to register, and if you use the code RTAPOD30, that's RTAPOD30, you get 30% off your registration on me just for being a listener to this podcast. So I hope to see you there. Now, let's listen to Dr. Mills. Hey, thanks for making time for us. I'm actually super pumped about this conversation. The very early part of my career, I have a background as a software developer, was in telecom, and not so much voice and telephony, but it overlapped a little teeny bit. And so it's just going to be fun for me to listen to the stories you have to tell. And the story that I'm looking to get to is like deep history of telephony and kind of getting up into mobile devices and, telephony becoming wireless and the changes that has driven in the world, and kind of ending with smartphones and where all that is. So anywhere in there, let's what's the brief history of telephony?
Oh yeah. How to be brief about the largest and most complex machine in the world for most of the 20th century, the telephone. So I'll just say it's great to meet you. And my name's Mara Mills, and I am a historian of the telephone and a professor of media studies at NYU. And I have a degree in history of science, my PhD. Long before that, I was a biologist. Do not ask me how I switched from biology to media studies, but there we go. And my mother was a telephone operator. She was a telephone operator at Pacific Bell in Palo Alto, at the old office that used to be right by the Palo Alto train station down by University Ave. If you know Palo Alto, I think you've worked in Silicon Valley.
I do. I have worked at a company that was on University Avenue, right by the Caltrain station there.
That's
I currently live in Mountain View. So,
yeah.
wow.
Yes.
Okay.
So she was hired there in the 1960s, and she was 18 when she first got hired. And I think her experiences that she described to me of working for Pacific Bell expanded my idea of what a telephone was and got me interested in researching this seemingly simple technological device, which is not at all simple and which has had a profound influence on electronics, on all telecommunications today, also on how we understand human speech and hearing, and the formation of new virtual kinds of relationships. So yeah, when you wrote to me, I was thinking to myself, what are you thinking when I say the word telephone? What do you imagine when I say the word telephone?
Yeah, and that's I'll take that question. I like it. I remember as a child rotary telephones, not as they were old fashioned, sort of transitioning from rotary to touch tone, but it wasn't as a retro curiosity. It was like that was the device used in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a teenager, having phone calls with my friends, well, that's what a phone was. It was this shared thing throughout the whole house. You could pick up, My sister would be talking to her friends, and I could, okay, this is real. This is too long of an answer, but unscrew the mouthpiece, take the microphone out, pick it up so I could listen in.
Oh,
Absolutely terrible
yes.
thing that I did, but like that's what phones were in the 1980s. They were this shared voice thing.
Oh, I love that you were hacking into your phone because, phone hacking, phone freaking is such a big part of with Steve Wozniak and, like, the
Uh-huh.
origins of, like,
And I
personal
read about
computing as well.
freaking in the
Yeah,
80s as a nerdy teenager, thinking, oh wow, that's cool. You mean you
yeah,
can just have little tone generators and make sounds, and that controls the phone? Wow,
yes.
what's going on in that world?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, my students today, when I ask them what a telephone is, if they even think of anything prior to the cell phone, portable phone era,
yeah.
they have a vision in their mind of something like a push button handset, maybe a rotary dial handset, which they might not even know how to use or have any sense of what it sounded like, or how it operated. Um, and I have to explain to them that, like, behind that handset was this massive, massive socio-technical system. Of course, in academic media studies, we always pair the social world with technology, so telephones they didn't engineer themselves, they didn't act on their own, and even automated devices like the rotary phone, which was an early example of electronic automation, looks so simple and basic. That is sophisticated automation circa 1920s.
Yeah.
Um, but there was always sociality. There were always humans involved in as laborers, planners, designers, and users. Phones only work if they're connected to other phones. So you have to have wires, in some cases wireless. You have to have telephone exchanges because not every phone can be connected through millions of wires, one point to each other phone. You have an exchange, which allows a minimal number of lines. You have, before the 20s, you had exclusively had operators because there
To
were no
set up
dial
that
tones.
circuit through the
Yeah,
exchange of my
you
phone
had
to your phone.
you pick up a candlestick phone, said hello. An operator on the other end would ask you who you wanted to be connected to, and they would connect you. The By the time you get to the rotary phone, you have really elaborate electronic switching systems that eliminated some of the work of operators. So and it was that was sophisticated engineering. What seems so basic, a rotary phone, that's electronic automation. So the telephone is much more than the handset. It's this entire universe behind the handset. So the early days of the telephone, there were a lot of, you know, Alexander Graham Bell, one of the inventors of the telephone. Of course, there was also Elisha Gray and other people. There were a lot of debates. He got the patent, many other
Okay.
inventors. He had an idea that someday there would be universal communication, a telephone in every home kind of thing. I don't know if he quite envisioned a telephone in every pocket, like that. There's a difference between having a home device and a truly personal individual device.
There's a
Arguably,
huge difference between those
huge
two.
difference, huge. I mean,
Yeah.
and a telephone in one's home doesn't mean it's a personal electronic device. But yeah, the early days before there was the capacity for like home to home or business to business communication, there were all sorts of plans for what a telephone might be. There were the telephone was even used almost like a broadcast medium. There were telephone pulpits. There would be a telephone at a church with wires going to the houses of elderly people who couldn't make it to church. There were telephones lines in hospitals going from a nursing station to beds. There were telephone newspapers in different cities, in New Jersey, in Budapest, where a subscriber could sign up, and somewhere in their city there would be a program of newscasts, and you would pick up your phone at certain times of the day to hear sports or to hear a musical broadcast. There were things like theatrophones, where theaters in Paris, also in New York, would have subscribers, and you could at your house have a wire going to a performance, and you wouldn't have to go out.
You just listen to
This is like
this
not even pandemic times. You just but
3 kilohertz
not
channel.
wanting
It's
to
it's
be
it's the
in a
same as
crowd.
being there. Yeah.
Yeah, but eventually there is a stabilization of the definition of the medium of the telephone. into one-to-one live voice communication, which is what we've been describing. And in my field, in media studies, we understand a medium to be slightly different than a technology. A technology is like the hardware or the apparatus. To
Sort
become
of
a
an
medium
implementation. Yeah.
is that, yeah, the application, the use is part of that. And sometimes like a company or an inventor can like prescribe what a medium's use will be, or they can forecast it. But a lot of times users like appropriate and hijack a
Uh-huh.
technology and do all sorts of unexpected things with it. So eventually there's this moment probably in the right around World War II, telephones become a mass service. That's 70 years after the invention of the telephone. There's a mass amount of people who have telephones in their homes or in their businesses and are able to use it. And there's a consensus that what a telephone is this synchronous live voice communication, which that was a radical thing, because with telegraphy, you didn't it was asynchronous,
It was
and
asynchronous,
most people
exactly.
didn't have telegraph systems in their houses. Some people did, but most didn't. And you'd have to go somewhere to an office, write out something by hand, pay a telegrapher to send it. They'd put it in a pile. They would send it at some point. Then someone else would have to, at the other end, another telegrapher would receive it, type out or write out the telegram, and then someone would deliver it to that person's home or business. So it was very much a synchronous process, and it was text based. So that this full duplex communication, which we've come to apply to all sorts of forms of telecommunication, really starts with the telephone. So define the telephone as a medium, we often imagine it to be this voice communication, which is not unimportant. Like I said, that was a huge coup to have simultaneous communication. But that's not what the telephone was always. We have to imagine expanded telephony if we really want to capture the history of what the telephone was. It always had the potential for so many other uses, um, and users understood that potential, and so did engineers.
It seems like that full duplex voice circuit thing was the killer use case that drove widespread adoption and a phone in every home. But even along the way, using that same network for data, and I'll just go by history I know,
Yeah,
so I'll
totally.
say stuff and correct me if I'm wrong. But like by the 70s, you've got acoustical modems that are just using the regular public switch telephone network as a data network.
Yes.
Um, and in my own experience, by the late 80s, I've got a 2400 baud modem, and I'm playing proto online games with my buddies.
Mhm.
And then my sister picks up the phone to make a phone call, and our game crashes. That was back in the day. But beginning, I see the beginnings of using the phone network as a data network in my own experience. And of course, it had long been a data network prior to that. Not always, but I don't know how far back that goes.
There were data phones at least in the 1950s, if not earlier.
Really?
There were, I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
there is an untold story of the many ways that the telephone was a business device. Um, And so, yeah, there were data phones that combined like calculating machines with telephone service. There were also, in addition to POTS, like plain old telephone
Right.
service,
Thank you.
publicly switched telephone service, there were always PBX telephone systems, which were installed,
Yes.
inside
So that's
inside one business.
like
But
big
that
office
business could be
building. It's kind
massive. It could
of
be,
their internal phone network with a big connection that goes out.
and they had their
Is
own
that right?
switchboards. And there were a
Yes.
lot of like data phones inside massive hotels or railroad companies, or massive corporations would have PBX, private branch exchanges. So yeah, there's a longer history of data, and in a way, there's a convergence of telegraphy and telephony that might be anachronistically called data,
Yeah.
they're transmitting things other than the voice over telephone lines.
Yeah.
Has a
I
long
mean,
history.
I would buy that. I mean, I get that it's anachronistic, but telegraph is is data. I mean, it's encoded letters.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Well,
So
and then digital voice, pulse code modulated voice, which becomes
right.
possible in World War
When does
II.
that really enter the picture?
Well, it's a World War II. There were experiments around the world with what came to be called pulse code modulation before World War II. So, like in the British and Parisian telephone networks, there were experiments with converting the analog voice signal into a digital signal, what we would now call a digital signal. Um, and the reason for that was to have a more robust signal, especially for transatlantic communication in the face of enormous noise. A digitized signal was thought to be recoverable in a way that it would be less distorted or
Right.
destroyed really by noise. So in during World War II, there were a number of experiments with pulse code modulation for coded communications for the reason of
Okay.
encryption. And then after World War II, at Bell Labs, you have people like the famous Claude Shannon, who also drafted this manifesto. I would call it a manifesto
Met,
of
yes.
formulae information theory that gave really a roadmap of a number of formula for either turning an analog signal into a digital one or streamlining existing digital signals, compressing them or fitting them to human sensory organs by getting rid of information that human ears and eyes weren't capable of detecting. If you really read Claude Shannon's 1948 paper on communication theory, it's a roadmap to a lot of the ways that we think about digitizing signals today. But he also worked on pulse code modulation, as did a ton of other Bell engineers. It didn't become possible commercially for decades, but it was um, they had military and other and experimental applications, certainly from World War II forward.
Ford. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah. Shannon, I have, believe it or not, I actually have read that paper. It's been a minute, but um, yeah, and that's kind of like setting the tone for sort of like saying, okay, everybody, here's your boundaries. Now go make stuff inside of this.
Yeah,
Uh, Amazing. As we get into mobile telephony and phones are different. Like you asked me at first, what's a phone?
yeah,
And I'm thinking of when I was a little kid. Now, a phone's a camera and an internet terminal with an optional voice chat feature. And I always ironically refer to a phone call as, I'll say maybe we should shell out to voice chat for this,
yeah,
which is the thing that you might also decide to do with your telephone sometimes.
yeah,
But get us through that. Like, um, when do phones become mobile? And I think that's earlier than a lot of people think. And then how do they get married with data, and what's that doing
absolutely.
to life?
No, this is a question that I've asked myself first. To answer the first part of your question, which is like, do why are we calling these things phones anymore? It sounds like maybe you aren't. Maybe you're saying, "Hey, let's bust out the voice function," or "Let's go to
Yeah,
voice chat." Although
yeah.
voice chat is something slightly different.
I
It's like
know
a,
it's,
it's
and
like a voice memo.
yeah, I say that, and when I say that to people uninitiated with my ironic use of the term, it's actually confusing. So I don't know why I do it, but yeah,
Although it's like my millennial friends and siblings love voice chat. They love sending voice messages,
yes,
which is
yes,
interesting. I mean, so I've actually wondered this because in many nations and different and linguistic contexts beyond the US, the word phone isn't being used that much anymore for our handheld mobile
things.
devices. In Germany, they often call this what a handy. There's some, I mean, for 20 years, and there we've had motos and mobiles and handies, and the word phone is gone in a lot of linguistic contexts for what we still in the US tend to call a mobile phone or a cell phone. So I've wondered, why are we still calling this a phone? It's an utterly converged device. It's a convergence of some telephone principles, some
Mhm.
telephone hardware, some telephone um, components, some telephone principles of use, but also radio, also obviously computing, um, also all sorts of glass technology, screen technology. I mean, it's a massively converged device, and I've wondered if we use the phone still, if it's a marketing ploy, because calling it a phone makes it seem less like a luxury device and more like a public utility or a security essential. Why not call it a video, a multi-purpose video game? I mean, it's so
Yeah, yeah.
if most people are not using it for the voice function, why are we using the word phone in English? I don't have an answer to this, but I have speculated about this in publications before. So, one thing I'll just say to close this out, and then I want to go back to the question of when phones became mobile and portable. Is the phone. There have always been attempts to make the phone asynchronous. And there were, starting probably in the 30s, I think, attempts to couple telephones with record players to make answering machines because people didn't,
Oh,
well, because people didn't like the
yeah.
fact that you didn't know who was calling.
Okay. And
There was
even
what was
then,
called,
they wanted a way to screen
you
calls.
answer the phone, you have an intrusion into your private space by, I don't know, an employer,
Could be
a
anybody. Yeah.
mother, whoever, and so there, callers wanted to have agency over, or the called wanted to have more agency over the caller. Callers for a long time had what we would say hegemony. They knew who they were calling. They knew what the purpose of the call was. They made the call, and someone else on the other end had this intrusive ring. Sure, they might have wanted to have synchronous, depending on who was calling, they might have been excited to, your sister and her boyfriend wanted to have synchronous communication, but a lot of people wanted asynchrony, to have control over that communication setting, to call back at a convenient time, to have a sense of what the topic would be before engaging in the call, all sorts of other reasons. So I think, yeah, when we use a mobile device today, there are reasons. Some people still want the voice, but they want it to be asynchronous.
And suddenly it's become like a new norm has emerged that it's rude just to initiate a new voice call, synchronous voice
You
call
schedule it.
unannounced. Like you schedule that,
Yeah.
or at least you text. You use asynchronous text messaging to say,
Yes.
"Is now a
Oh,
good
yeah.
time?" Or
Oh.
can we set that up for 1:30? Which maybe
Mm.
that's what we wanted all along, and we just didn't really have a convenient way to do that. And the fact that this thing makes a loud noise and you just have to pick it up and see who and what they want.
If a mobile phone today is a convergence of the telephone and the radio spectrum, using cellular systems that are maximizing the radio spectrum so that lots of people can participate, you actually do have convergences of of telephone and radio, with things like handheld radios, handy talkies, walkie talkies, car, car two-way radios, CB radio. Those
Yeah.
have a very long history, and that history overlaps with what we think of as mobile phones, because what there's always broadcast radio, which is one to many, but one to one radio communication is not completely unlike, that's a form of mobile phone.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. That
so
completely makes sense.
yeah, and then you really start getting like cellular phones in the 1970s. But between the 1910s and 1970s, you have all sorts of two-way voice communication on trains or in
Right.
cars.
Yeah. There's all kinds of mobile radio communications.
But cell phones don't really get popularized until 80s, 90s. I mean, I didn't get my first mobile phone until the first decade of the 2000s.
I was
Um,
also a late adopter. I think it was 99, but
yeah.
like
Yeah, I
everybody
was a
got
late
home by then.
adopter,
Yeah.
in a certain, for an American in a, in a middle class bracket.
Yes. Yes.
There's a long, there's decades of adoption of cell phones. But yeah, there have been portable phones almost as long as there have been phones. So the question is, what's the difference between a portable phone, a truly mobile phone, um, and the personal aspect of the phones is also something that fascinates me. I mean, we when did phones become a kind of personal electronic that you almost wear on your body? You have it with you all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I think bedroom phones, like the princess phone,
Hmm.
is maybe one of the first examples of personal electronics. Hearing aids are another great early example of personal electronics. But early landline phones were not personal. You shared them with your family. I don't know if you had a phone in your own bedroom as a kid,
I did.
but many people didn't. They like there might be two landline extensions in a household, maybe one. It Once you start having a phone that you or an electronic device that you identify as yours, it starts to become personal in certain ways, which is a really interesting phenomenon. We now think of like, oh, personal computers, sure, but there's personal electronics before that. Yeah, there's a shift to a more radical individualization of phone use or whatever we call this thing use, and also like always on you,
And
constant
that's okay.
touch.
That's the thing. That's what I kind of want to end with. That
Yeah.
now, because now we're here and it's always on and it's always on me. If you just think about the internet, um, there was in the '90s. It would be dial up, and maybe there'd be one phone line you'd have in the house. It was very much a session. You'd say, "I'm start," okay, nobody pick up the phone. I'm going to do this thing now, and I'm going to go online, and then I'm going to not
Yes.
be online. And then there's broadband, and I just walk up to my computer, and it's always there. And then there's this period of time until now. There's a computer in my pocket connected by radio to that same network, and we call it a phone, and it has integrated to legacy telephony and has those features, but it's always on and it's always on me.
Yes.
Um, what does that do to life? I mean, that's a huge question, but what do you see in your, as a scholar of the history of telephony? What are the things that hit you about that always on me device?
Well, as a historian of telephony, I often say that the telephone was so successful that it destroyed the need for telephony. Now, your bigger question of what does it mean to be always on? That is a very hard one to answer. And if you came to my department, media studies at NYU, and went down the hallway that I'm on and knocked on every door, each of my colleagues would have a slightly different answer. I think there's the tide right now in the field is turning towards looking at questions of labor, maybe as much as use. And I think other people are asking questions about like, outsourcing and pay and mining of minerals and where what's happening around the world to allow users in the US to use these devices, who's doing the labor,
Sure, sure.
what
And where's
environments are
the
being
where's the
destroyed,
lithium coming from and
where
all
are
that?
we dumping
Yeah,
our electronics afterward, and who is it harming. So there's also that take about there's no such thing as a free lunch, and what is the question might not correctly be what is it doing to us to be always on, but what is it doing to the planet to be always on,
sure.
or what is it
Also a
doing
question.
in an e-waste dump outside of a craw or something to be always on. So that's another set of questions that people are asking about the environment and power and waste and labor. Um, but there are, some of my colleagues are very utopian as well and are asking, what's possible for activists and, connecting people around. I mean, the activism question is a big one. And how do we make more democratic systems and allow them to continue connecting people? The tech of, again, technology never works on its own. It's always a socio-technical system, and usually
Yes,
there's management questions and corporate questions that even if the technology is structured in a seemingly ideal way, it doesn't always get to be deployed that way. Our smartphones, or whatever we call them in the future, will always be facilitating, often in contradictory ways, but the problem of being always on is that we're being pinged by numerous. There's an instantaneity issue, and there's also like the multiple apps pinging us all day long issue. And multitasking it's not just about speed. It's about doing multiple things at high speed, multiple different things at high speed all day.
Which is what we do, whether it's what we ought to do.
And there you have it. If you feel compelled to help us spread the word and grow the real-time analytics community, you can give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever fine podcasts are sold. If you're watching us on YouTube, hey, subscribe and, of course, hit that notification bell. And you can always share your favorite episodes on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever it is you do social media. Thanks, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode.